pleasure to introduce Peter Haggett, Professor of Geography at University of Bristol. Peter, we started this, well, the first time we interviewed you was in 1982 in Bristol.
Mm-hmm.
Remember the time?
Very well.
And at the conclusion of the interview, I said, perhaps in 20 years we'll come back and do this again. Well, it's 18, and we're in Pittsburgh.
Right.
Can we try it again?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Now, one other thought. We were constrained by our equipment in those days, in that we only could go for about 10 minutes.
Right.
We can go on forever.
Right.
So, if you don't mind, we're going to sort of redo a little bit of that interview and start with your childhood. Give us a sense of your background as a young man.
I was a country boy, a village boy, and I suppose the two big effects in early life which affected me were firstly rural location. We weren't very well off. My father had a small holding. He erected farm barns and this kind of thing. We didn't have a car. And if you think of the combination of that and wartime, where even if you had a car, you didn't have petrol to run it or an allocation, it meant that the country I grew up in really became my home. And in a sense, the background, the landscape that I learned to love. And rather, as I said in the book, in Carl Sauer's point about locomotion should be slow, the slower the better. I had no choice but to have slow locomotion. It was the only thing we could do. So in a sense, when I went up to Cambridge at the age of 18, it was the first time I had left that area. I'd literally been to London once in my life. And in a sense, it was a complete translation from a limited rural background to suddenly going to what effectively was then, as it is now, World University with all that implied. The other thing that was important, I suppose, was that it was a very strict nonconformist Methodist background, and one that played an important part then, and it still plays an important part now in one's thinking. I'm very lucky in that I went to a village school where the two little Quaker ladies who taught at the village school, there were 25 of us, as I remember at that stage, maybe a quarter of them were Haggetts, because it was Haggett country. There were lots of them around. My mother was a Haggett, as my father was, even though they were not related, so all sorts of DNAs getting mixed up in that particular way. But the two ladies who taught me were of the generation where they had both lost their sweethearts in the First World War, the Great War, and then had devoted the rest of their lives to teaching. And so you had this tremendous concentration of good teaching on a little group of children. And the thing went on when I went on to so-called grammar school then. I was very fortunate indeed in growing up in a very loving family, but also a family which had around it this great love of learning and so on.
Were you exposed to geography as a young man?
Yes, in that it was part of the curriculum. The thing which really pitched me into geography, I think, was of course good teachers. I think we mentioned earlier people like Harold Story and so on who drew my attention towards it. But the critical thing was when I was a youngster, about the age of 16 or 17, I injured myself quite badly playing that mad English game of rugby. And for about 3 months I lay in hospital in a kind of plaster boat, I suppose it was, unable to do anything except to keep absolutely still. That was what was needed at that stage. And my mother brought me the first sort of serious geography book I'd ever read, and that was a book by Charles Cotton called The Geomorphology of New Zealand. And I lay there, and the way I used to read was to have the book on my chest, and then there was a complicated series of mirrors. I couldn't turn my head, and I sort of would move the pages, and by a system of mirrors eventually would see this. And there were just these brilliant pictures of landforms in this country, and I was determined I was going to see these eventually. It took me 30 years to get there to see it, and also to study them. So I really went to university really with physical geography as absolutely the apple of my eye. That's what I wanted to study.
And you say Story is the one that directed you there?
That's right. Yes, he was the man who really, as it were, pushed me towards Cambridge rather than anywhere else, and it turned out that was a marvellous choice.
Well, you ended up at St. Catherine's. How does that happen? Was that?
It happened mainly because of Methodism.
Mhm.
I was supposed to be going to St John's College, and because I needed to win what was then called a scholarship, you, to be a scholar of a college, you needed in certain colleges to be a communicant member of the Church of England. There was actually a religious bar, and of course as a card-carrying Wesleyan, that was something I couldn't do. So there were only 2 colleges in Cambridge who would in fact have geography scholarships, and I didn't know at the time, but it was a brilliant choice because it took me to a college which was a real powerhouse for geography at that stage.
Well, who were some of your mentors and instructors in those days?
Well, the key people on the most important instructors were the youngsters you studied with, and that they were critical. And I was fortunate in that I shared a room with a man called Ken Warren, who went on to be an Oxford Don. He wrote a great history of the historical geography of the iron and steel industry. Michael Chisholm was the next man in the next room to me. On the other side was a man called Gerald Manners, who wrote on the geography of the energy industry. Peter Hall, now Sir Peter Hall, in town planning, was 1 year ahead of me. And it was days when conditions were fairly tough on the food side, and that I remember in fact going to a meeting in Peter Hall's room where he said, real Nescafe will be served. In other words, this was a real breakthrough.
Yeah.
We had to take our ration books and all the rest of it. So they were the first group, your fellow students. Then you have the actual dons, and of those, I suppose, a man with the marvellous name of Augustus Caesar, who was as magisterial as that name sounds, who was my tutor. Very little known in terms of the world outside, but a marvellous teacher. He would shred your written work, your essays, but then give you the courage to reassemble them again. A marvellous mind and a great teacher of almost a Socrates-like way. And of course, we met in my own case in groups of 2, and that was really penetrating weekly meetings. Then I suppose the third thing was for a young kid coming from a place where we had a fairly good library at home that tended to be on the theological end, but to just go into one of the great libraries of the world and realise that was your inheritance for the next 3 or 4 years. That was your life, as it were.
Well, did you concentrate on geomorphology in the beginning?
Yes, I did. And indeed, right through to I graduated. That was the great love of my life, particularly glaciology. Why I didn't continue in that area is an interesting question. Firstly, 2 of my friends died in glaciological exploration. That one was caught in a meltwater stream, and the other died in one of these deep cracks, the Bergstrunds, towards the top of the glacier. I'd already, in fact, started to fall in love with a girl who, 46 years later, I also know precisely, we still meet across the breakfast table, and to that extent, she said, hey, you're going to be going off in this kind of direction. She was studying teaching and psychology at the university there. But then I came across this marvellous book by August Losch. The year was 1954. It had just come out from Yale University Press. And it was a kind of almost a solid state physics of the settlement system. And I thought, well, that was marvellous. It was rather like my interest in snow and ice, crystal structures. But in this case, it was crystal structures which were man-made, and I thought I could live with this and take it forward. And so I started my PhD and just did 1 year on that when a job came up. And in those days, if a job came up, you raced for it.
May I back off just a bit?
Sure.
Steers, I know he wasn't a glaciologist, but did you have an opportunity to
Oh yes,
work with him?
he was a great figure in this way. I got to know him for this reason, in that we had a great storm on the coast of England in the spring of 1953, and this changed the formation of a whole series of shingle structures and things which Steers was working on. And so he wanted them all resurveyed in the summer of 1953. And he put a notice up saying any undergraduates who would be willing to give time during the months of June, July, and are adequate surveyors and so on, would they go and do this? I volunteered, and so I went with a man called John Small, who then became professor at Southampton University in physical geography, and we spent the summer surveying, because part of the geography curriculum then was that you had in fact to be able to produce a pretty high standard map. And you started with the question, where am I located? You had to actually work out from the stars and latitude and all that, or exactly where you were. You had to use INVAR tapes to work out the baseline, and at the end of the day you had to produce a map which would pass muster. So that was the kind of geography I grew up in. So in a sense, revising a coastal map was... So my first publication, oddly enough, was simply a map of changes on the coast of Norfolk, which was subsequently
Based upon that work.
Based upon that work, yes. And the other team, which was working further along, and the two of us met, was Michael Chisholm, who was actually working, also had signed up on this, and so that was great.
Well, before we leave Steers, did you know his wife, Harriet Wankland?
Yes, I did.
I'm familiar with her work, her book on Roxall, but
Oh, yes.
she was called Mrs. Steers, was she?
Yes, when I first went there, before she was married, she was Harriet Wankland, of course, and then, to the great excitement of all, she and Alfred married, and in due course produced two children. And you can imagine, as young undergraduates, this was a very strange goings on in relation to all that. They were lovely. Harriet herself was a delight, in that she was a very good lecturer, although she had the disarming habit of always lecturing with her eyes closed, which you never quite got used to that. But I took her courses which involved the study of Eastern Europe. I think it was called the Eastern Marshlands. But some people we ought just to mention, I think, in relation to Cambridge, was all the people who came through. For example, in glacial geomorphology, I was lectured to by Richard Foster Flint, the great quaternary specialist from this country. Oddly enough, in New Zealand, Charles Cotton, or Sir Charles Cotton, as he was, came and talked about the landforms of New Zealand. A man called Shepherd lectured on submarine canyons. There was this great number of people coming through. And someone I grew extremely fond of was Glenn Trewartha, who was a visiting Fulbright professor, and he taught classes on climatology. But the great thing about him was he was always in at 7 in the morning, and always ran up the stairs. And these two things was the young Trewartha, but he was a marvellously evocative teacher. But Cambridge was a great place through which people came, as it were, in this kind of way. And that had a very big effect. I was very blessed in many ways.
Well, now let's go back to Lush again, and your early work with Chorley. What can you tell us about this?
Well, Dick Chorley had, to put him into context, we had several things in common. Firstly, we came from the same part of the country. We were both from the little county of Somerset. He was 6 years earlier than we had, but we'd had a very similar upbringing, in that Dick's background had been, in a sense, quite a small rural one. I remember when we first met, he said, I was very lucky as a boy, Peter. When I grew up, I had a coat of arms over my door, and I said, "Oh, what did that say, Dick?" And he mentioned it, and I thought, well, that's curious. I went back and looked up the Latin dictionary, and if you translate the coat of arms above his door, it was, "We are frying tonight." You know, it was a small shop producing bagels,
yes,
or
yes.
that kind of thing. So Dick had a great sense of humour, and we both, in fact, we got on very well. But he had, in fact, historically it's important, in that he had gone to Oxford. He really had not enjoyed Oxford at all. And then he did his graduate work at Columbia University under Arthur Strehler. And so it was there he was exposed to all the kind of quantitative geomorphology. He then became a lecturer in geology at Brown University. And then his father died, and this brought him back to this country, and then to Cambridge. And we hit it off marvellously. A huge sense of humour, in a sense he's a Falstaff-like character, as you know, in many ways. And he had the idea that we should, first of all, try and make sense of this interface between physical and human geography. Because there were so many things which seemed to us to be wanting and in common there. Things we could search for and find common structures. So we worked on a number of papers together, and myself and Chorley and Stoddart wrote a number of papers in physical geography at that time. We then found this lovely old country house outside Cambridge called Madingley Hall, and it was at Madingley, which was owned by the university, where we started the courses for teachers, and they ran from about 1959 through until I left in 1966, and that was bringing back people from the schools for a one-week residential course, and we got all kinds of people, like young David Harveys and so on, to come and lecture on what was going on in university geography, and encourage some of the teachers to see whether it made any sense to try and introduce some of those things into schools. So I imagine the average age of the lecturing staff was maybe 30, and the average age of most of the teachers was 35 or something like that. And it was that led to frontiers in geographical teaching. It led to models in geography and so on.
Well, a small detail, were those teachers versed in geography, or was this introduction to it in a formal way?
No, they were all geography teachers who were not very happy with what was the prevailing syllabus of the time. So in a sense there was a touch of, I suppose, angry young men, but it was fun, and it was a lovely old Elizabethan house, and in the evening we would go and play croquet and bowls and things like that, and it was residential and so on.
Yeah, you mentioned Stoddart. Was he just coming on board at that point, or what?
Yes, he had come on board and was of course very much the apple of Steers' eye, because he wanted to work, as Steers himself had done, in coral reefs. And David, in fact, who was an expert in that area, and immediately went off and worked to begin with on the reefs in the Caribbean, particularly off the coast of Honduras, where Steers had worked, and then went down to work on the Great Barrier Reef in the Pacific. So on.
In the early 60s, you had a side trip to Berkeley. What was that about?
That was an intrigue. I at that stage was working in Brazil. Steers had been visiting professor at Berkeley, and had mentioned my name to Jim Parsons, who was then the head of department. And I taught at Berkeley what was then called summer school. And summer school was just, I think, around a couple of months or something like this. So I went right through South America, and then carrying my case went all the way up by Greyhound coach to Berkeley. I went from Miami to Berkeley via Greyhound.
That has its pluses and its minuses, doesn't it?
It does indeed. So I kind of unfolded myself, as it were, when I eventually got there and started. Stoddart had played a great trick on me, because Stoddart knew Berkeley by then fairly well, and was also starting to work in the Pacific. And he said to me, "Whatever you do, Peter, Jim Parsons is a very sharp dresser, and he demands very high standards from his staff." So I lugged all the way through South America and across the Amazon and so on. This black suit, white tie, college tie, and so on. So I went in to give my first, Parsons was aware, went in to give my first lecture at, I think it was 7 o'clock or something. And these girls and guys were there in Bermuda shorts and all the rest of it. That's right. And I thought, well, okay, that's one standard for the students, but you've got to keep yours up. So eventually, after 2 or 3 days of this, Jim came back, and I went and I knocked on his door, and his secretary said he's inside. Parsons was at his desk with one foot sort of on the desk like this, a Hawaiian shirt which was open, and he was busy scratching his chest. And I realised that Stoddart had set me up on this, and we became great friends. And I think that Jim was one of those. There were 2 people outside the UK who, whenever I applied for a job, were always my external referees. One was Jim, who I thought the world of. The other was Torsten Heggestrand, who, that's another story.
Yes.
So,
did you mention to Jim how you'd been set up?
oh, I did, yes. And of course, he saw the joke over there. And his wife was even more amused. Betty was even more amused than Jim was over there.
Well, you come to Bristol at what time? Oh, was that early 1960, what, 3 or 4?
That's right. That's right. It would be around. My first job was University College London. I had two years there with Sir Clifford Derby, and then I went back to Cambridge, as you did if they called you back. It wasn't a permanent job or anything, but they said they would give you a 3-year job or something. And my wife had enjoyed it very much, so we went back to Cambridge and had 2 very great years in London, and then 8 years in Cambridge, where I finished my PhD, because that's in being a resident, I could then finish that off and get that out of the way. But it was.
Well, let's pause for a moment and give us a sense of Clifford Derby.
Clifford Derby was obviously a great scholar. He was also a slightly absent-minded scholar, in that he one day would seize you by the arm and talk all about college politics and all the rest of it as though you were long-lost buddies, and the next day would sweep by you in the corridor. He had certain lovely habits. One was, if he wanted to suggest to a member of staff who he had taken on that maybe he wasn't going to make the grade, and the system was then you had a 2-year appointment. If they liked you, you would get offered then not quite tenure, but certainly maybe a 5-year, beyond that, and eventually tenure. If you didn't quite come up to standard, then they gave you 1 more year to go. And what Clifford did was that you would find in your inbox, in your mailbox, an advertisement for a job somewhere, like lecturer in the University of the South Pacific or something like that, and attached to it, in Clifford's inimitable handwriting, was, "I should be very happy to support you for this post." And you knew in that case that if you received one of those, that was the black spot, and you were on your way in this sort of fashion. But if I can remember the time I went to him worried about publications, and I hadn't produced any, and I told him about this, and he looked over his desk at me and said, "Haggett, do you have anything worth reporting?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't think I'm working up this Brazilian and Portuguese material and so on." He said, let it stay. And then he leant across and put his arm on my arm and said, "Young man, when the apples are ripe, they will fall." I always loved that, because it seemed to me it was a very different world. And when I think of the advice I now give to my own graduate students and so on, saying, get publications out, it's a great competitive world out there. And I think it was a very measured one, but it was a fine department. And Bill Mead, great Scandinavian scholar, there, good geomorphology, an excellent department, as it has remained. And it's one of the 2 or 3 outstanding departments in the UK.
Was Michael Wise there at that time?
No, Michael was down at the London School of Economics, which was part of the University of London, but not actually part of University College London. And each one had a different character. There was a man called W.G. East, who was at Birkbeck, and then geomorphologist Wooldridge would be at King's, and then Michael Wise, and indeed still Dudley Stamp even at the London School of Economics. It was still that period. Then it was back to Cambridge, and then.
Well, how did the Bristol opportunity come along?
It came along. I think it came along at a stage in my life when my father had just died. For me, it was important for purely family reasons to try and get back to West Country if I did. We'd reached the stage where we had 4 small children in a very small house. And I mean, the children were very important to me. I was once asked about locational analysis, and someone said, "How did you get to write that in a fairly short time?" It was in my 20s. And I explained that the reason I had to write it in a hurry was that we lived in a very small house, and my study was also my eldest daughter's, our only child then, the nursery. So at 6 o'clock it switched and became nursery. But the switchover wasn't always all that good, so sometimes there was a little tiny thing put in her cot, and my daughter at that stage loved to hear the sound of the bell at the end when you typed on the typewriter. Yeah. And so one of the ways of sending her to sleep was to keep on making this bell ring. And so it wasn't before WordPress, you just kept on typing, and eventually she'd go to sleep. That was another chapter done. Yeah. So that was actually absolutely true. What wasn't true was that the number of chapters in the book was determined by the number of bars in the cot, because what I used to do was to use that as a file and put the manila files with the chapters through the cot bars behind you. And if you count the number of chapters, they were that isn't quite right. There was a spare one.
It's a good story, though, isn't it?
It is. It's a
very good story.
Good.
Well, what did you do when you first arrived then at Bristol? What kind of work are you involved in?
Well, I was still working then on basically at Cambridge. To begin with, at Cambridge, I'd had to teach almost anything that was going. And basically, new members of staff then were just given the things to map interpretation. That was me. Map projections, right? History of European settlement overseas. Basically, it was a marvelous training because you had to work your way around geography, and although at the time you mightn't actually appreciate it, looking back in retrospect, it was a marvelous trade. You had to trade your way around.
Yes.
And indeed, you even had to teach physical. When I went to Berkeley, for example, I taught geomorphology at Berkeley. I didn't teach.
That was your first attempt at teaching that? Oh, no.
It was indeed.
Yes,
The first and only course I did was for John Kessler at Berkeley, which was nice, and indeed that took me to talk to Sarah and so on. But going back to Bristol in this case, it gave me the opportunity there to give some lectures on areas I was really working on, like locational analysis, like network analysis, and so on. And I began to take on, as it were, the more technical areas of human geography, to write them up and to publish them. And I always had the system of actually writing lectures with a view at the end that I was going to convert those lectures into book form if any publisher would be interested in publishing them. And the world of publishing was very different then, in that rather than writing a book and someone giving you a contract to write it, what you did was to finish the book and then go and see if you could find someone to publish it. And the first book I wrote, I remember going to a publisher, and he was a Shakespearean scholar, their editor, and they didn't produce geography. He said, Mr. Haggett, why are you bringing us this? We don't publish in this field. And it was a firm called Arnold's. Well, I said, I got a list of publishers, and Arnold's was, I started at A and intended working my way through. So he said, okay, we'll publish it. And so that was locational analysis. So it produced, I know, 25,000 copies or something like that. So he obviously thought it was a good thing to do.
Well, that put you on the map, really, didn't
That's
it?
right. Yes, it did. And that was just before Bristol.
Yes.
65 that came out. 66 I got the chair at Bristol.
Well, now, this text, was it Geography and Modern Synthesis? What was the origin of that?
The origin of that was that I left, Bristol didn't have a formal pattern of sabbatical leave, but they were very generous in allowing you time away as long as you did your full teaching load and did it by pressing up in certain areas, and then, as it were, finding a little space to get away. And I came over to work with Michael Dacey at Northwestern University and Bill Garrison's group there. And while I was there, locational analysis came out, and Harper and Row had an economist called Andrew Melville, I think his name was, and he rang me up one day at Northwestern and said, Peter, would you consider writing a geography text for us? And I think there's a kind of euphoria after you finish one particular book. And you say, oh yes, sure, I can do that. And that must have been about 1964, 1965. It didn't actually appear until 1972. And I was very fortunate in that Harper and Row were part of, they knew their business of publishing extremely well. And I sent them a very long manuscript, and they said, we're very sorry, but we simply can't publish this. And they turned onto it an editor who had worked in Scientific American. He was a physicist. And he read through the thing, and he said, boy, I've got to come and see you. So he flew across the Atlantic, and we sat down, and in the course of a week, he turned the book around. For example, chapter 1 became chapter 24, he junked certain things. And he said, look, I've got a PhD in physics, I'm a reasonably intelligent kind of guy, but I don't understand what you're doing. And what he did was to circle in red, and he said, you have a marvelous habit of talking about a particular concept on page 10 and then actually explaining it on page 27 or something like that. So we went through this in this kind of way, and that man did a superb job. We lost half the length, which was splendid, which is most manuscripts need that. And then, in fact, it got going, and once it got going, it obviously caught the wave, because in a sense, whether it was a good book or not, I don't know, it was certainly a timely book, and that whatever it had to say was what people at that stage were wanting to hear. And so for them it became something where every 3 years they came back to me and said, will you give us a new version? And so between 72 and something like 86, 4 editions came out, and it sold, well, leaving aside the translations, it sold perhaps 175, 180,000
Really?
copies.
Was it mostly in the States?
Mostly in the States and Canada. Canada was always a big thing for it. And then the reason it didn't go on was that I decided that other things were pressing in on me. I was running the university, I was acting president of the university for a while. I was on a whole series of national committees. My life was sort of changing away from that. I think it got to the stage where unless you do it every 3 or 4 years, it loses momentum. And so I thought, well, that's a part of your history. Okay, it was interesting to do. It's indeed.
Let it go.
Let it
right?
go.
Yes.
And it wasn't until about 2 years ago on retirement that they came back to me yet again and said, look, I know it's now, it'll be nearly 20 years since we published the last edition of that, but would you mind doing it yet again? And I decided, well, I'd have one last hurrah, as they say, and so sometime next year, a new version called Geography, a Global Synthesis, is coming out, but that's running ahead of time. But it was.
Have you started that?
It's finished.
Oh, it is finished?
Unless I get divorced by the end of the month. And if I haven't finished it by then,
Okay.
my wife's going to divorce
Good
me.
probability on that, huh?
It'll be finished.
Yeah.
In other words, it is mostly done, and I think I have a feeling that you can't revisit old areas, and I'm not sure that they're right to want to.
Well, now, is it changed substantially?
It's
updated?
changed, in my way it's changed, but I suspect you can't ever take yourself away from the period in which you worked, your background, so I'm sure that for me it was quite a big change, but I think for someone looking at it will say, it seems like it's the old lamb dressed up as mutton, or whatever, or mutton dressed up as lamb, or whatever it's going to be. So I should be intrigued. I'm writing it largely because I think to some extent I was sad that it kept on selling when it was more and more out of date. And so people were buying something which really were paying good money to buy something which really ought not to spend their money on. So
That shows you're a man of conscience, doesn't it?
I'm not sure over some things. Over some things. But
You know, when we came in '82, you were heavily involved in administration, and you've alluded
yes,
to that.
yes.
Would you just tell us how you were, what is the word, pulled into it?
Well, it was partly pulled and partly my own silliness, because I've always felt that that any subject that really needs to be represented not just in its own sense, but also higher up in the university. So when the deanship came up and I was asked, I went on the basis I'd say yes to all of those. They would get in the way of one's teaching and so on, but I don't think if you're say dean of an area, or later on vice president or president, I don't think you can help your own subject. Indeed, the reverse way, because you've got to be shown, like Caesar's wife, to be beyond reproach. Therefore, in a sense, you can be quite tough on your own field. But you can prevent silly things happening to it, sometimes even by accident. I think that's important. And the other thing is, I think if you're working along with a group of people on a committee who may be experts on everything from Chinese poetry to heart surgery to, as you do when you're on a committee of deans like that, or with fine lawyers and so on, if the individual gets a certain amount of respect for doing his job as dean well, that rubs off down the line on the department as well. And I feel that one of the problems of the field at the moment is that perhaps not quite enough people have followed, like Gilbert White and so on, and run places and occupied these kind of positions. And if the opportunity comes up, in a marvellous case is David Ward, who's doing such a good job as being president of
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And I mean, that must mean very good things for Wisconsin geography, because in a sense he ran the department, then became an outstanding dean, and now I think is an outstanding chancellor in that sort of way. And that's a
Indeed he
great
is,
help to
yeah.
and the more people we can have doing that, the better it is. So that was part of the thinking.
How long did you serve in that capacity?
I served 3 years as dean, 3 years as deputy president, and then I had 1 year as president. I was asked to actually become president, but it involved a lot of different kind of work. It involved fundraising, it involved relations with government, and I think also my wife and I have always put our own family absolutely first, and she has loved being, in a sense, I hope, in a sense, being as we are, a small family, not getting very, we do a little bit of entertaining, not anything very much. The thought of suddenly being projected into a field where your wife also had to take on a pretty heavy burden, which, depending on your partnership, some of your partners might love doing that. I think it would be all part of the excitement. For us, it wasn't.
She enjoys incognito. I
absolutely,
presume. Yeah.
very much in that
Yeah.
kind of way, and I think it would reflect our family life in lots of ways. So that wasn't to be.
Well, now, in 1990, a book that I'm a little bit familiar with, The Geographer's Art. How did it come to be written, and what was its main message, if you can?
It came to be written again, like most of these things do, as a series of accidents. And one of the essays I loved reading in the Geographical Review, looking back, it was Gladys Wrigley, who was the editor, who wrote a marvellous piece called Adventures in Serendipity. The whole business of things happening in a happy and rather mysterious and unplanned kind of way. And the book really came in that sort of fashion. The Leverhulme Trust, which is one of the big charitable trusts in the UK, gave me some time off from the university. They paid for someone to do my teaching. And I went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and for something like 3 to 4 months, lived up on the upper floor with dear old friends like Glenn Trewartha and Dick Hartshorn and Arthur Robinson and Henry Sterling and that whole great mass there. And the youngsters referred to it as, I think we were referred to as being the antiques attic or something like that. And they were like schoolboys. They'd come in, they'd pick up the annals or something, and Dick would say, "What do you make of this paper?" And so we'd sit around over coffee looking at this, and they may have been in their 80s.
Do a little bit of complaining here and there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so that was great, and it gave me the opportunity to write. So it was a series of really of personal reflections and essays, and as you go through it, it seemed to be a book which I wrote entirely for myself. It wasn't written as a text for other people. It was really a reflection, if you like, a celebration almost, of how much I'd enjoyed geography, how I'd got into it, how it had given me certain things, and how one had made mistakes and learned things as you went along. And so it was a series of pulling out some of the things which are part of geographical scholarship as I had found them. I didn't really write it for general consumption at all. But it was in a sense a self-indulgent book.
Were you pleased with the result?
I was pleased with it because my children said that they enjoyed it better than anything else I'd written, and that's a great.
It may be the only thing they'll read that you ever wrote.
Absolutely. I mean, they're in different kinds of areas, and so they said, "Dad, there was some quite fun things." And I think also they liked the fact that I quoted something at the end of the first chapter, which. From Oscar Spade, whose writings I always loved, and he said, and I can't remember it exactly, of course, but he said the geographer's role is to try and make sense of the world, and if he finds that this doesn't give him either, that the world is not either tragic or logical, then he finds his pleasure in private love and public service. And I thought that was, and Spade said, I've been happy in both of these. I thought that was a marvellous summary. In a sense, you try and make sense of a field, but in the end, if it doesn't make sense for that, then these other things are going to be. So and that all seemed to be very important.
Well, can we switch to focus on epidemiology?
Oh,
and in the
yes.
beginning, and
Yes.
the origin, why?
Yes. Back to serendipity.
Yes.
I was working on locational analysis and trying to carry that further at Bristol. By then, for a number of reasons, I'd been in contact with Torsten Hegerstrand. And Torsten said, yes, I think it's a good area to work in, though he himself was now working in other areas. But he said, you must in fact try and get something, try and look at a phenomena which is repetitive. So if you have any ideas, if you want to build any kind of modelling, any kind of forecasting, you've got to have a diffusion phenomena, which in fact is going to happen time and time again. Then you can see if
For
it's
comparison
working.
purposes,
That's right.
yes,
So you can
yes.
work out a model,
Yeah.
see if it works,
Mhm.
try it on the next time
Mhm.
period. And so I said, Torsten, that's good advice. I'll do that. I said, well, what shall I look at it? And we decided that one of the worthwhile things to look at would be the ways in which little fluctuations in the economy, whether it's in Pittsburgh steel or whatever it is, tend to work through a local economy with a kind of business cycle repetition every 4 or 5 years or so. I was working on that kind of area. And we published, the little group I had at Bristol, had published half a dozen papers or so on that, using unemployment data and so on. I was working also with Les King up at Master and so on. A little group was working on this. One day in, I think it was November, there was a transatlantic telephone call. My secretary, they weren't so common in those days, and so my secretary came in and said, there's a transatlantic telephone call, Prof, but I can't quite make out what he's saying. It turned out to be Brian Berry. And Brian said, Peter, I've got the flu. I said, Brian, I'm so sorry, because I'd stayed with them not long before in southern Chicago. And he said, can you give me a hand? And I said, well, of course, what can I, how can I help? Well, he said, I've got to be in Geneva at the World Health Organization because Marston Bates, who was a great biologist who, along with Carl Sauer, of course, was involved in the man's role in changing effects.
Yes.
Marston had advised WHO that they ought to have a look at the epidemiology program. They ought to bring in people who are epidemiologists, medics and so on, but also anthropologists, geographer and so on. And Brian had been chosen as the geographer to work on that. And I said, well, Brian, how can I help you? He said, you wouldn't mind going for me, because I clearly can't get out of Chicago. I really am not fit to travel. I said, fine, of course I will. But when is this? He said, there was a pause. He said, tomorrow.
Oh, my.
So off I go, and 24 hours later I've cancelled my classes and I'm spending 5 days in the World Health. So I sit there on the 5th floor of the World Health Organization with very distinguished statisticians like Watson from Princeton and medics and so on. And there, in fact, in front of me is my name, B.J.L. Berry, because I didn't have time to change the things. And so at the end of the time, typical UN, we had our 5 days, we all had to write a report. And the typical thing of international organizations is you've got to write your report before you leave, and of course it's translated into several other languages overnight, because you don't get paid any expenses until your report is handed in. It's a marvelous way of sharpening the mind. So I sat down with these other people and said, come on, Peter, what are you going to write on your 2 pages on geography or so? So I wrote my 2 pages and suggested some. I took some of the kind of modelling things I've been working on and said maybe we can use these on diseases which are also repetitive in this kind of way. And I came home, I thought I'd never hear any more about it. But 10 days later there was a telephone call from Geneva, and it was Norman Bailey, who was the chief statistician. And he said, I've been reading this report on whatever. I think we could actually use some of those ideas. Would you come back to WHO and tell us something about them? And I said, well, if you want me to, I will do it. I'm not sure there's very much more I can say, but Bailey and I really struck up a very good working connection. And then I had the great good fortune to have a young graduate student called Andy Cliff. Andy had worked with Michael Dacey, and then the whole thing came together, and I found myself doing more and more. And because I think when you're dealing with, particularly with medical things and children, and particularly with the statistics on children's diseases were particularly good, I found myself working on that. And then somehow the pace got sharper and sharper, and really, I suppose, we must have produced a dozen books and reports and atlases on this, and it's just been, there's another big one on the history of epidemic diseases, which I'm working on at the moment, quite apart from this.
When you say we, do you mean who, or do you mean Bristol?
I
or-
really mean, no, it was really a group. It was largely the person who increasingly has taken the lead on this is Andy Cliff. Andy was my first graduate student at Bristol. He had a marvellous mathematical mind. He worked with Dacey and Garrison and so on. He then went on, is now Professor of Geography at Cambridge. He worked with one of his great friends, was an econometrician who became Professor of Statistics at Penn State and now at George Washington University. So Keith Ward was the other member. And then, of course, there was always a medic who was actually to make sure that we were actually making sense on the medical side. And this system of working where 3, 4, 5 of us would actually write something together became a very effective way of working. And then we found that the records in the little place in we looked at the Scandinavian records, we knew they were good. We found the Icelandic records were incredible. And so we did a lot of work on Iceland, and that again was going back to Bandis Wrigley and serendipity. Went to Reykjavik, went to the main library. We'd already got some modern records, and we said to the archivist there, I don't suppose these records go very far, do they? Iceland being Iceland, we had detailed records kept in old shoeboxes, which went back to about the 1880s. Later I came here to CBC down in Atlanta, and their mouths all said, where did you get records like this? We don't have anything pretending to be like one. So it's a long story, but because it's a little island, it, like the Faroes Islands, it was subject to dreadful epidemics once in a while. Once an epidemic got in, it sliced through the population in this kind of way. And so they became very conscious of the importance of defending against these outside invaders. And they set up where you can only think of it as a kind of early warning system. And each doctor had to report back to the central place at Reykjavik. And these doctors usually fishermen and farmers as well, because there wasn't enough doctoring to do. And so they kept the most meticulous records, and these were sent back. We were able to trace the spread of diseases in a remarkable way. And what's so interesting today is that all this work in the human genome, where are they actually going to really sort out the human genome in terms of its link again to Iceland, because the Icelandic records are the best in the world.
Do you say they were successful in preventing disease from coming in?
They were sometimes successful, but when I mean successful, they were successful in the early days, because what they did was, when it got into an area, they isolated it. It became a police matter, and in fact they would close the schools, close the harbour. They wouldn't try and prevent the disease, they'd just let it burn itself out like a forest fire, and not allow it to get into the rest of the
And that did work.
That did work.
Yes.
It worked in the sense you had dreadful death rates in one area, but of course it didn't in another way. But if you follow as the forest fire analogy, it's as though the trees are dropping leaves and so on. And of course, if you get a lot of small fires, you clear all that up. If you don't have an epidemic, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and every so often you get a real huge epidemic, which sweeps through the whole thing. So whether it's a good divisive process or not is a matter of debate, I think.
As is the forest fire. That's where the analogy
Exactly, that's where the analogy
yes,
comes in. You can
Yeah.
have, and you very often
Yeah,
have
yeah.
preventive burning. To some extent, even a vaccination program is in on that. But what I've found is, if you think of the geography of the thing, what I've found in this particular case, so marvellous in working with medics, is that they always accept you on whether you can make any contribution to their problem or not. They don't have any hang-ups about whether geography is a subject or not. They simply say, if you can add something, even if it's 0.5%, to the problem of dealing with kids' diseases, come on board.
We want it.
If you can't, we don't want long words or something. If you can get on board and do something, and I find that sort of very pragmatic attitude to science a very, very effective one.
Now, you expanded this to other islands later on.
Yes, we did. We worked
Yes.
in Fiji, and this next month we had a big book called Island Epidemics, which is an Oxford University Press book, which is 300 diagrams, 600 or 700 pages, which is our summary of the work so far. We thought we ought to bring it all together, and that's coming out then. I'm very pleased to see it on the shelf, and that's mostly written by Andy Cliff, who's by now taken over, one of his graduate students. So we now have 3 generations. Grandfather, Andy, who's one of my graduate students, one of his graduate students. And I think that gives us a good sense of continuity.
That's the way it should work, isn't it?
Well, maybe.
It doesn't always work.
It doesn't always
Depends
work.
on who's the grandfather.
So that's fun. It's worked well.
Yeah, what about your measles book?
That was an attempt to. We found that one of the best marker diseases was this disease of measles. I'd had it, all our kids had had it. Troubled them very much. I didn't think it was nice disease because it was very well behaved statistically. And of course occurs pre-vaccination in huge numbers. But I hadn't really thought of it as being a major thing. And I look at the figures, and it's killing 2 million kids a year. It's still in the top 10 causes of death in the world. And it's a really important virus disease which is much overlooked. And so what we did in this case was to pull together all the work we'd previously done and produce something which I'm sure no one will ever, in a sense, want to do again. And that is, we took the period from 1840 right through to the end of into the 1990s and tried to present a picture of the geography of the disease. We checked, I think we can say we checked every single paper on the disease ever written. There are 12,700 of them, to check whether they had any geography in them. We took out what we could find there, and in fact put it all together. The WHO have now asked us to do a similar job on polio. Whether we're going to have enough effort to do it, whether I'm going to live long enough, I don't know. We'd love to do so. It would be.
If you say there are 2 million children today with measles?
2 million who die.
Die?
Who die from measles.
Where are they? These undeveloped world?
Africa.
Yeah, Africa.
Yeah. Predominantly Africa. And the same is true of the work we did on AIDS. I felt that we were starting here a great pandemic. Usually, in fact, a pandemic has occurred in the past, cholera or here we had a pandemic occurring absolutely underneath our noses. And so what we did, in fact, in 1993 or something, was to produce an atlas, again quite a big atlas, trying to pull together everything we could find on the first 10 years of the spread of that disease. There were chapters on San Francisco, chapters on Africa, chapters on whatever. And it wasn't, as we say at the beginning of the preface, anyone who reads this book is going to read a book which is out of date. You may even be amused at the kind of patterns we appear to see because knowledge will have moved so quickly over this area. But at least we've got it. We've now got the first 10 years mapped in tremendous detail. I'm quite proud of it because in a sense I think it will, looked at in 50 years' time, they'll say, well, these guys at least caught the beginnings of this great pandemic. And
how does the medical community view this work?
I think the one on AIDS, I don't know, because it's such a huge community. And there are more papers written on AIDS since 1980 than on most of the other infectious diseases put together. I mean, it's grasped the medical imagination for very, very good reason. So whatever you do is a small tip in the iceberg. I think I can only say that firstly we've on the others I can speak about that is that WHO have given us an open ticket to go back and work as visiting scientists whenever we need. We're under pressure for them to do things. 2 of our students have worked on the AIDS program as geographers working in Uganda, and 1 now back at WHO. On the other side, we've had the most tremendous help of CDC. The Centers for Disease Control have been marvellous. Again, they give us visiting scientist status whenever we want to. We have an open thing, and in fact, last time we went, they gave us 2 full-time research assistants to work for a year, entirely at their expense. And it's simply, I think this is the medical view. It's this very pragmatic. They're not interested in geography as geography. They're simply interested in solving
You can just
a problem.
help us a little bit. We're interested.
That's right. And the analogy they use, which I think is a very interesting one, is it's like making a plane fly. Anything that can make you can get a little bit of weight off that tip of the wing. Yeah. And I think as geographers, if in a sense we sometimes were not quite so worried about the size of our contribution, and simply said, if we the size of the help doesn't matter, it's actually making it. Because if you don't make it, curious enough, it may not be made, and you may actually be able to design a vaccine program which is more effective, because it goes into the right areas. You don't waste vaccine in areas when it's badly targeted or something like that. And every dose of vaccine is $5 or something. So if you can target that spatially in a way which makes sense, that's what Peter Gould was working on before he died, in a way. And I think there's, and there must be others. I mean, I listened to Dr. Graf's presidential address this morning on hydrology in rivers and so on. I thought he had exactly the same approach. I mean, here's a big problem of river systems and so on. Here's a geographer making some kind of contribution to that. How big, no one will ever know. We leave that to history. You just have to make it.
If we can very, shall we say smoothly, move into your public service, UK National Radiological Protection, etc. Would you just sort of tick that off for us?
Yes, that was fun. And perhaps it says something about the way in which geography is an expected part of government committees in the UK, and a way in which it may not be in all countries. But the National Radiological Protection Board always have had an environmental scientist on board. And I was asked if I would go on, and I said, well, my interests were really rather more on the epidemiological population side of this. I said, as one always does when one goes on a public committee, how much time is it going to take? And the answer came back, well, we have 4 meetings a year. There may be a bit of additional work, but that's about it. And you'll send papers, and you come. We want your advice and so on. I said, fine. I forget what date it was, but 6 days later, Chernobyl blew up. And we weren't meeting 6 times a year. We were meeting a lot more frequently than that. And this is a committee made up of, it's largely medical. I imagine that 2/3 of the people are radiation specialists. But they're also concerned about the environmental setting. And that's I should explain, it's the government body which is charged with the protection against radiation, and so it has about I suppose 600 or 700 scientists and laboratories and so on. And one of the things I was pleased to do there, amongst other contributions, we were increasingly under attack from the various environmental groups, Greenpeace and things like that. And together with the chairman, who was a biologist, I suggested the notion that we would meet with these groups every few months, not to argue the toss about things where we were always going to have different views, but simply to see if we could reduce the amount of scientific debate. So we agreed on the kind of figures we were talking about. It meant we could then disagree about things we really disagreed about, how you interpret these figures, and that actually proved to be very useful indeed. And it ended up, to give you an example, some of the bodies there were using equipment to measure radiation, which simply was not. So we actually calibrated their counters and so on. So we could get them. And I think there was a greater respect on each side.
That was amazing, though, wasn't it?
Well, even though, in a sense, you would expect people to disagree. Of course they do. Of course they do.
What about the Wellcome Trust?
The Wellcome Trust has been tremendously. That's an area which I'm just finishing. I finish this September. I've had 8 years, and I received a call asking me if I would become the chairman of the subcommittee on the history of medicine, and I agreed to do this. And the reason was that the measles book had come out, and obviously someone had picked up this historical survey of this major virus disease. But the director, who was a biochemist, said, "This is a committee, Peter, which has got half of which are medics and half of which is historians. We don't want either a medic or a historian." So I said, "What you're saying is that my ignorance in both these fields gives me marvellous." And she said, "You got it in one." So I took the committee over, and in fact, and then have done 2 4-year spells, and it's a very, very worthwhile one, because we've basically been able to. It funds, first of all, it funds an enormous library in history of medicine. It funds probably 50 or 60 posts across the country. It just pays for everything. it funds major research programs and so on. And it is the biggest medical charity in the world. And to give you some idea, it doesn't matter, but I'm responsible for about 1% of the Trust's funding, and my budget is way over 10 million, which gives you just the sort of size of this. So it's much bigger than Ford or Rockefeller.
Is part of this trust to go out and find more money, or is
No, it's entirely that the money really comes from the Borough's Wellcome Foundation. The old man, Sir Henry Wellcome, left this money in trust, and it says something about the growth of the pharmaceutical
What about your
industry.
research in Swedish human geography?
That proved fun too. The Swedes, in fact, every so often have a review of their programs, and so I conducted, as Gunnar will know, I shared this. We went around all the departments of human geography. We talked to people. We wrote a report on this. There was myself, a very distinguished Danish geographer, and a distinguished Finnish geographer. So I had to read all the bits which were in English, but I don't read Swedish, and they did the Swedish. And what is so nice about Sweden is, firstly, they do it so thoroughly. Secondly, the thing is formally published in a volume so big at the end. And then they have a meeting at which all the departments on which you have made judgments and so on themselves make judgments about the judges. This is typically Swedish. So we had the most polite exchange, and Gunnar was present at this, and was marvellous, as you can imagine, where the Swedes said in the politest kind of way whether they thought we'd done a reasonably good job, a not very good job, a poor job on various sorts of sections.
And that's the Swedish tradition, is that what
very
you're
much
saying?
so, yes, that you allow those who are judged to actually judge back in this kind of way. And the kind of conclusions we came to seem to stack up against those for psychology and economics and so on as well. And Sweden is an enormously interesting country, and it was a chance to go down and talk to Torsten and have an evening with him, which has always been a great pleasure. And he's frail and an 80-year-old now, but still dominating intellect. I think.
Well, now, is it true that you're retired?
Yes.
Are you really retired? It doesn't sound like it after this discussion.
Well, I think I am in the last big project on emerging diseases, which is something for WHO. I said, can I not be part of? And I may still do something on it, but I didn't want to. I feel that for the last, we've been now 40, 45 years or so, I feel that for almost all our married life I've been calling the shots of where we lived, what we did, how we spent our time. And I think I feel that I'm entering a period of life where I really want to say to my wife, look, you decide where we live, what we want to do. If I keep busy doing this and that, and writing a little bit and doing a little bit of research and so on, fine, if it keeps me out of mischief, as it were. But I don't want that to be the dominating thing. I think I really want to have a time of my life where you realise that to some extent you're off working in Brazil, or you're working in the library, you have 4 kids growing up, looking back, you wonder how fair it was to be quite so much. I wrote to Joe Gould when Peter died and said, we took so much of his time, which really belonged to you and Dickie and Katie and the children. And I don't know, my own Brenda's view is that I'm more trouble than I'm worth when I'm not doing that. I worry about other sorts of things. And I do remember, in fact, going to, if I go back to Sir Clifford Derby, we had a marvellous memorial service for him, and that was in King's College Chapel in Cambridge, a beautiful old medieval building. And I was talking to Mrs. Derby afterwards, and she said, I said to Clifford when he retired that when I married him, which was nearly a half century before, I married him for better and for worse, but not for lunch. I think my wife has a similar. So fine if I'm back in the evenings and so on, but she hopes I found something to do. She doesn't want me under her feet for the whole of that period. So I think I'm going to adopt a Derby-esque thing in this kind of way.
Have you not just come out of successful surgery in recent times?
Yes, thank God in every kind of sense. I think I'm nowadays I think open heart surgery is perhaps the commonest of the
Mhm.
major bits of engineering. It's done me a world of good.
Had it been plaguing you for a long time?
Yes,
or
it had. It had, and I hadn't realised what the problem was until I was visiting my son, who is a physician, who came with us once on a visit to the Australian National University, was entranced by the outback,
Mhm.
and so decided he would become a flying doctor. And so that's what he trained as a flying doctor in Australia, and then now runs about 11 practices in an area, I don't know, half the size of Pennsylvania, maybe the size of
Mhm.
Pennsylvania, I don't know. And I went out to see them, and his wife, who's also a physician, they run a little hospital together, said, I'm going to send you in for tests at the University of West Australia or something. So I had tests and arrived back, in fact, from Australia with a string of information, which they then... But it's interesting because one of the things in having this, and this may be true of you too, Wes, I don't know, is that you suddenly realise that you belong to a very honoured group. And David Harvey, who's had exactly the same surgery, and Torsten Hagestrom. And so we formed a little society called the Society of Bypassed Geographers. we think that maybe you should have a little star against some of your films of all those who are actually part of the bypass.
Well, I will consider that. I will consider that. That's a wonderful idea.
Bypass can have many meanings.
Well, I have a final question for you that we've sort of had a quick pull through in your career.
Mm-hmm.
If you had it to do over again, perhaps there are perhaps some supplementary directions you might have taken.
I think I could answer that more clearly if, in fact, I'd had a plan. But in fact, I think I've been marvellously blessed by going back to serendipity and a series of happy accidents.
Mhm.
If I hadn't been a geographer, I think I did at one stage have a great interest in being a veterinary surgeon, and I'd have gone on in that kind of... at school, all sorts of
Mhm.
things are possible, aren't they? Once I got past that particular line, then I think accident has followed accident, and to some extent, I think Churchill once said something I'd always found very interesting about Ashnet. He said, we worry too much about making the right decisions in life. I think we should spend more time in making the decisions right. I think what he meant by that, life deals out
Yes.
certain things. If they're dealt to you, well then make them work.
Well, now, who did you say said that?
Winston Churchill.
That's what I thought you said.
Winston
Churchill. Well, I want to thank you very much for doing this, especially after your ride last night. What time did you get in last night?
But 1 in the morning
Ooh.
in British time.
In
but
British time.
Perfectly good time
Yes.
here. Yeah, no
Well,
time.
I know that this has been rather difficult, and I really appreciate you doing this.
Wes, it's always pleasant to talk, and thank you so much for all you and Nancy have done for the series.